This is the Anthrobiology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Welcome to another episode. Back in December of 2019, I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Levy from Hunter College in New York, and we talked about cold adaptation. The interview is especially interesting because Dr. Levy works with modern populations, which is challenging and pretty uncommon amongst biological anthropologists. And I think that it can make the importance of her research feel more immediate. I think the other really interesting aspect of Dr. Levy's work is her use of pretty clever methodology. It's something that I've always been interested in, and I'm excited to talk to someone who is pioneering new methods for studying new things. So as you're listening, I want you to watch out for Bergmann's rule and Allen's rule. I think those are probably going to be your takeaway ideas that you might be able to use at the next cocktail party you attend because you're fancy, so you go to cocktail parties. I also have a few technical notes about this show. Sometimes it's really hard when you are the only person making a podcast, so I made a couple of mistakes this time. And I just wanted to own up to them here at the beginning. The first one is there is a lot of background noise in this show. I don't know how to take it out because I am new at this, but I encourage you to, instead of being annoyed by it, perhaps using it to create a sort of ambiance for the interview in your mind. Just imagine both Dr. Levy and I in our creaky old apartments with our banging radiators, because that's actually what happened. The other thing is that as we were talking, Dr. Levy mentioned that she didn't remember when Neanderthals spread into Europe, and I didn't either, and we kind of just glossed over it at the time. The truth is that happens sometimes. You just forget dates. So I took the time to look it up just in case anyone was curious. Neanderthals showed up in Europe around 400,000 years ago, and humans joined them around 40,000 years ago. And the last note is that I forgot to ask my second question of what Dr. Levy was reading right now for work. So I substituted an article that she actually mentioned having read recently for work in the middle of the episode. As usual, you can find all the articles mentioned on my website, anthrobiology.com. And I hope you enjoy the show. Hello, everyone. This is Gabby LaPera. I'm hosting this interview from my apartment in San Francisco, and joining me via Zoom is Dr. Levy, who works at Hunter College in New York. Just in case you hear some weird bangs in the background, that's her radiator. I also live with the radiator, so I know that pain. But yeah, I'm really excited to have you here on the show. Can you introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us about who you are and what you do.
Yes, I'd love to. Hi, I'm Dr. Stephanie Levy. I'm a new professor here at CUNY Hunter College. Just started this past fall. Really excited to be living in New York City and taking it all in. I study how the body adapts to cold temperatures and how our evolution and lifestyle influences variation in metabolism.
That sounds so incredibly interesting. I'm so excited to have you on. You already know we were talking before I actually started interviewing you. I totally nerd out over endocrinology things. And for listeners who don't know, endocrinology is the study of the hormones, the hormonal system in the human body. And you may be asking, what does that have to do with cold adaptation? And we will get there. But I just want everyone to know how excited I am about this interview. Okay, so cold adaptation. How long have humans or human ancestors been living in cold areas?
Great question. Well, and there's some debate about when that really began. There's a lot of research focusing on Neanderthals and their adaptations to cold climates and how Neanderthals' adaptations to cold climate may have influenced their morphology. And as Homo sapiens expanded north into Eurasia, they likely be exposed to cold temperatures. As far as exact dates go, I'm actually not entirely sure about the exact time.
So one of the things you mentioned with the Neanderthals was changes in their bodies to the cold. What kind of changes are you talking about?
A big one is in terms of their overall body size and the length and proportions of their limbs. So there's two main rules that are and trends in morphology that we observe that seem to indicate that we adapt through our morphology to climatic stressors. So one is Allen's rule, which suggests that shorter limbs and are adaptive to cold climates, and Bergmann's rule, which suggests that a larger body size is adaptive to cold climates because a larger body size will lead to a smaller surface area to mass ratio, which can allow the body to conserve heat more efficiently.
And so when you say larger body size, do you mean like they're taller or they're like shorter and rounder, or what do you mean?
So shorter limb length and a larger core size, and an overall larger body mass.
Okay, I understand now. So you're saying like they're physically like they potentially like weigh more, so they have a lower ratio of actual surface area, so that's their skin to the internal mass that they have.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. So can you see this in populations today?
There's a great paper by Bill Leonard and Peter Kaczmarczyk. I think I'm mispronouncing his last name, but it came out kind of a while ago, but it does a nice job of reanalyzing some data that was in an article from the 1950s, looking at the relationship between body proportions and climate to retest this kind of old idea that limb proportions may be under selective pressure due to climatic stressors. And that they found that while the relationship is weaker today, they still found an overall trend suggesting that in colder climates, we observe a shorter relative limb length and an overall bigger body mass.
So that actually kind of segues perfectly into another type of adaptation to the cold, which is potentially why we're seeing less of that structural adaptation, which is cultural adaptation to the cold. And when I say cultural adaptation, these are things that humans do to deal with the cold. So, for example, central heat or wearing nice, fuzzy, warm boots. Having those kinds of adaptations can decrease the selective pressure for having like structural physiological changes.
Yeah, exactly. And that those cultural adaptations are a big part of why humans have successfully expanded into every corner of the earth. You can find humans living on every continent, and our cultural and technological adaptations are a huge part of our success in lots of different climates.
Yeah. And then, so there's also a third kind of, this is a trident of cold adaptation. So there's like these like structural, like whole body changes, and then there's the cultural adaptation, but then there's what you really focus on in study, which is kind of an internal systemic change that helps people adapt to the cold. And you particularly study something called brown adipose tissue and non-shivering thermogenesis. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means? I just said a lot of really big words. Like maybe we should start with what brown adipose tissue is.
Yeah, no problem. So brown adipose tissue is a type of fat. It's similar to white fat, which is the primary form of fat on the body. Typically, when we think of fat, we're thinking of white adipose tissue. Or white fat. And that's the type of fat that has evolved to store energy in the form of lipid. Brown fat also stores some energy. It has fat vacuoles, but its primary function is to generate heat. And so brown fat is called brown fat because it's actually physically brown. It has a high concentration of mitochondria, which contain iron, and that iron gives the brown fat its brownish color. And the way brown fat works is that when the body feels cold, the brain sends a signal in the form of norepinephrine to the brown fat. This triggers brown fat to express a special protein in its mitochondria, which make the mitochondria inefficient at metabolism. And so that inefficiency leads to heat production, and we call this brown fat thermogenesis.
So I'm just going to stop you for 1 second, and I'm going to go over some of the terms that you said.
Great.
As everyone probably remembers, the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. That's maybe the only thing a lot of people remember from high school biology. And so the mitochondria, they're in charge of producing energy. So that's the energy that you use to move your muscles. And one of the byproducts of producing energy is heat. And so what Dr. Levy is saying is that instead of producing energy for the muscles, it makes the process of using up those energy stores, the lipids, which is also a fancy way of saying fats. Instead of being efficient and making energy to move your muscles, it's being inefficient and just creating more heat.
Exactly.
That's a way to keep us warm.
Exactly. And so babies have a lot of brown fat, and it turns out some adults have brown fat too.
Oh, that's really interesting. So when you're born, you have a lot of brown fat, and then as you grow older, you start to lose that brown fat?
Yeah, exactly. So it reaches a peak percentage of your overall fat in just the first few weeks of life, because a newborn infant has really underdeveloped musculature. Those weak muscles are unable to produce heat through shivering. So instead, the infant is relying on brown fat to keep the infant warm. But as infants grow and develop, the brown fat mass will deplete, it'll decrease. And today, most adults have very little brown fat.
But that's not necessarily true in the populations you study, which are circumpolar populations. Can you tell us a little bit about the folks that you're doing your work amongst?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I'm really fortunate to be part of a collaborative project that brings together researchers in the US and Russia, specifically Siberia, in a region called the Sakha Republic, or Yakutia. And I am interested in how indigenous circumpolar populations have adapted to the cold climates in which they live. And I am fortunate and I have some fantastic colleagues at a university called Northeastern Federal University in Yakutsk. They're also interested in how adaptation to cold climates may influence variation in metabolism and health.
So do these people, the Yakut, did I say that
Yes.
right? Do they have more brown fat as adults than people who say live in California do?
Our preliminary data does suggest that that's the case, yes. So the way that I measure brown fat heat production is using a technique that is non-invasive. It's an indirect method. So what we do is we measure the change in skin temperature on locations of the body where brown fat is stored, particularly in the neck area, because we find most brown fat in the neck and just above the clavicle in the shoulder area.
The clavicle is your collarbone.
Yeah, exactly. And what we do is we take a baseline picture using an infrared thermal imaging camera. This is a fancy camera that measures the temperatures of the objects in the image. And so we can measure skin temperature by taking a picture of a particular part of the area with this camera. So we measure the skin temperature of the neck area, and then we have we cool the participant down a little bit so that the brain will stimulate that brown fat. And in order to cool the person down, we have the participant wear what we call a cooling suit. It's a suit, a jacket and a pair of pants that's lined with tubing. And we run cold water through the tubing of the suit so that the inside of the suit gets cool to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 15 degrees Celsius. And so we want to have the participant experience a temperature that is feels cool but not cold enough to stimulate shivering. And so after about 30 minutes of cooling, we then take another picture with the thermal imaging camera, and we measure the change in skin temperature of the neck area where brown fat is stored. And what we find is that among Yakut people, the average temperature of this area of the body after cooling is warmer, suggesting that the brown fat in their necks is producing more heat and warming that skin and leading to a warmer skin temperature. I've also used this method in Chicago and found that my participants in Chicago were not able to maintain those warm skin temperatures like we observed in Siberia. And this suggests that my participants in Chicago had less brown fat.
That is so interesting. I always find it fascinating how scientists create these very clever ways to measure what they're looking for. And especially since you're working with live populations, you might be one of the first people I've talked to who actually works with live humans. I think everyone else I've talked to has worked with bones. Like that creates a whole nother set of considerations for trying to find what you're looking for without being invasive. Because, if someone wants to do an isotope analysis of bone, like that's not a problem. You just take out a chip of bone and you melt it down, but you can't do that with live people.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm very excited and interested in the development of new non-invasive methods that biological anthropologists can use, and as well as public health practitioners. And so it's something that's exciting to me to be able to try out new techniques. It's been fun.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's so interesting to me about you working with current populations is that what you're studying now could actually have ramifications for current people who are actually alive right now. So I want to talk a little bit about an article that you put out that looked at what happens when you have an increased amount of brown adipose tissue and non-shivering thermogenesis in terms of kind of health standards or health outcomes. One of the things that I saw in one of your papers was that people who have greater amounts of brown adipose tissue tend to have lower rates of cardiovascular disease and higher insulin sensitivity. And that second one is really important, folks, because insulin is that hormone that kind of goes haywire in diabetes. And if you are insulin insensitive, it can have some pretty serious consequences for you. What was also really interesting was these people with higher brown adipose tissue, they have higher hypertension rates, but they still have that lower rate of cardiovascular disease.
Yes, exactly. And scientists are still trying to draw the connections between the exact mechanisms that connect brown adipose tissue to health. But I think this is an important issue given that in Siberia, as in many places in the world, there are growing rates of diabetes, that simultaneous changes in diet and lifestyle that may put someone at greater risk for diabetes. So understanding factors that may be protective, I think, is an important research question.
Yeah, and you had this 2016 article that looked at subsistence lifestyles of the Yakut people, and you found that people who have greater participation in kind of more traditional subsistence methods have a greater buffer against those kind of traditional ills that you see with a sedentary lifestyle, like diabetes, like cardiovascular disease.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah. I don't know, I know that you're a scientist, and so it's kind of your job to speculate, but it also kind of isn't. But would you like to speculate as to why that might be?
There's probably a lot of factors at play. So 3 that come to mind is differences in diet. So if you're participating in more subsistence activities, then you likely have access to healthy foods that are lower in processed carbohydrates, so lower in processed sugars. You may have a more active lifestyle in terms of physical activity. And so you're you may be up, moving around. And also, these subsistence activities require a strong social network. So, some common subsistence practices in Siberia include herding cattle, growing vegetables, going hunting. And these are intensive activities that are often done as a family or as a community. And so, if you're tapped into a strong social network, that may have benefits for your health in indirect ways that may be separate from your diet or your physical activity.
I think that probably at this point in 2019, everyone has heard of the obesity epidemic. Some people argue whether or not it's an epidemic, but I think that it's pretty clear that obesity rates are rising around the world. So this kind of research could have implications for other countries and other people. Have you thought a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think cross-population research which is characteristic of the research that biological anthropologists do, is super important in shedding light on this issue. So on one hand, I think there's been a push by many academics and also activists to reconsider the utility of BMI in understanding cardiometabolic disease risk. And
I'm just going to stop you for 1 second. BMI is body mass index, and this is kind of a proportion of how much body mass you have versus your height.
Exactly. And so we typically think of high BMIs, particularly BMIs of 30 or above. The World Health Organization considers these BMIs to be obese. However, what we find in cross-population studies is that the relationship between BMI and other predictors of disease risk, diseases like diabetes or heart attack, there is variation in the strength of the relationship between obesity and these other predictors. For instance, cholesterol levels. There's a great paper comparing the relationship between cholesterol and BMI in Indigenous Canadians and Alaskans, particularly the Inuit. And punchline is that the dose-dependent response of obesity on cholesterol is lower among the Inuit compared to European Canadians, suggesting that the Inuit were able to have a higher percent body fat, a higher body fatness without some of the negative health consequences that we see in other populations.
I wonder if there's because of they kind of lived in this very cold climate for a long time, if perhaps they developed some kind of protective mechanisms against having cardiovascular effects from having higher cholesterol levels, because cholesterol is a really important molecule. It is the precursor to a lot of other hormones, and it also helps regulate your metabolism. Actually, and I realize we've said the word metabolism a lot in this podcast, but we've never really discussed what metabolism is. Can you give a definition?
Yeah, great. Metabolism in layman's terms refers to how the body burns energy, how the body is breaking down food and converting that food into energy that the body can use to run biological processes like building cells or hormones or any sort of biological process.
Sure. And then what you've been studying all this time and what we've really been talking about this whole time is how people in these very cold regions tend to have much higher metabolic rates.
Yeah, exactly. And in particular, we observed that indigenous circumpolar populations have higher resting metabolic rates. And we think that this may be an adaptation to cold climates because a higher metabolic rate will lead to greater heat production.
Mm-hmm. And this is what gets so crazy about hormones and metabolism and lifestyle, is that it all interacts in this crazy way. And it's hard to exactly know, if you change one lever just a little bit, what will happen downstream from that. But we know that all of these things are related and they have health outcomes like you're more likely to have diabetes or less likely, or you're more at risk for heart attack or less. And it's also interplaying with the environment, right? Like, is it really cold? Are you doing a lot of physical activity? It's really wild what you're trying to do. Bottom line.
Oh, thanks. I think it's interesting too.
Well, I think that this is probably a pretty good place to stop. It is time for my traditional last 3 questions of the podcast. And my first question is, if someone wanted to learn more about what you do, where's a good place for them to start? Like, what is an article they could read or a book they could read that would kind of give them a grounding to understand what you're doing?
Well, for one, they can visit my lab website. I have kind of a brief description of my research interest there. It's Levy, Levy, humanbiologylab.com.
And I'll post a link to that on my website.
Yeah, and then I got a somewhat recent article in the American Journal of Human Biology called Brown Adipose Tissue Energy Expenditure and Biomarkers of Cardiometabolic Health Among the Yakut of Northeastern Siberia. I think that gives you a nice rundown of brown fat among the Yakut and what our preliminary results suggest.
Definitely. I don't know if that article is available to the public.
Oh, right.
So if you want, I will post an outline of what I learned from reading that article. So that way we don't violate any copyright problems with the journal. And then last question, what are you consuming for fun, whether that's a book or a podcast or a TV series?
I've currently been binging Schitt's Creek. It's a great show. I'm a big fan of Eugene Levy and Daniel Levy, given our similarity of names. Yeah, that's what I've been watching for fun lately.
That is such a great answer. I feel like a lot of people who have answered this question have been like, I have to say something serious so people take me seriously. I think that that's wonderful. Folks, anthropologists, they're people just like you and me.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I could answer that I've got The Tangled Tree sitting next to my bed and I've been reading it, but I have not technically even opened it yet. So, but it looks like a really good science book.
Well, fair enough. I'll also put links to all of the things that you mentioned throughout the podcast, including that paper on Indigenous versus European Canadians. Thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. It's been a great show.
Thank you for chatting with me. It's been fun.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show is produced by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.